Okay, so talking to my niece, I'm gonna find out about the family. I wonder if Rob's still around, and I wonder if Erica's still around. Is she still living with you? No, she's not. Okay, where is she? I remember. I was with Andre Hurt one time. We were out in the mountains in West Virginia. I got pissed off because I couldn't finish cooking this food, and it was a couple days ago. It spoiled, so I threw it out for the animals. And Andre went out, watered the plants, come back and go, "What's with you?" I said, "Why?" Next thing I know, I'm looking at dinner and it's flying out the window. I said, "That's spoiled, by the way. We can't eat it. The animals can't." You know, they taught not to feed the animals out here. I said, "Yeah, well, sorry, I didn't know." Funny. I like that guy. I wondered what would happen if I would have married him. He was definitely marriage material, that's for sure. But I don't think that was his real name either, because I can't find him on the internet anymore. I knew where he lived, just forgot the name of it. It's like Lenny Deister, same thing, can't find him. That's his real name, though. But everybody called him Andre. Everybody addressed him Andre Hurt. It had to be his name. I think that's mushrooms up there. Those are big mushrooms. It's not snow because it's not melting. It's not cold enough for snow. Ride this motor. Two. Saw that already. 229. Randy, I'm really tired. I need you to come home. Here so we can go home. Let's see what Garmin says about this place. It's time to hook up Garmin. I haven't hooked up Garmin in a good 6 weeks. Might say 5 hours.
maybe we ought to get to know that this where the FBI got their hand slapped for what others might say was a attempt to prevent.
The FBI slapped its own hand. I mean, Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, was very critical of this memo. What was his point?
Yeah, I mean, he was called to testify in front of Congress, and he was eager to say that we do not police religious groups. I want no part of policing religious groups. Ideology is protected by the First Amendment. Afterwards, an internal report from within the FBI found that no actual wrongdoing took place, except that the memo was written poorly. The memo didn't adhere to the kind of special vocabulary that the FBI uses to discuss far right or far left extremism in order to avoid the impression that they are targeting a group based on its ideology.
Yeah, you're not supposed to use the expression far right white nationalist movement, which was a phrase that was used in that memo. What are you supposed to say?
So it's funny when you talk to the FBI about this stuff. For me, I had to first sort of go through a kind of vocabulary lesson. I had to learn the vocabulary that they use, because they never want to say far left or far right. They never want to say left or right. They want to avoid ideology and be neutral as much as possible in their discourse. And so they talk about domestic violent extremists, DVE, and they break those down into categories like racially or ethnically motivated extremists, most of whom we know as white nationalists, but they prefer to use the racially or ethnically motivated extremists. And they talk about anti-government extremists, most of whom we think of as kind of far-right militias, but a group that could also include, anti-fascist or Antifa activists who are throwing bricks through windows during, meetings of international financial organizations.
You're right. As I sat in the FBI office, I was feeling increasingly secure in my freedom to espouse bigoted violence, were I so inclined, but less sure of my personal safety from extreme attacks. Then it got scarier. The 4 FBI officials described how digital technology had further diffused and compounded the threat. What did they tell you?
So what that means, and this is something that for law enforcement is very much old news. The theme of the last 10 or 15 years for law enforcement has been radicalization online, that these far-right groups, or slightly earlier than that, some of these Islamist, extremist, militant types can proselytize and recruit and organize over the internet, right? So they can spread their ideology and plant the seeds for violence in ways that are very hard to police or detect. And they're able to, in the old days, if you were the Ku Klux Klan or Al-Qaeda, you were operating with phone calls, you were having organizational structures, you were having face-to-face meetings. In retrospect, that looks like it's pretty easy to target, identify, and infiltrate. But now, when you have these message boards and online chats, and everybody's anonymous, and they're spreading all kinds of bigoted or hateful ideas and encouraging violence in all kinds of dangerous ways, it's very, very hard to detect in advance some lone wolf, some young man somewhere out in the country who gets it in his head that this country is being overrun by nefarious forces and he needs to get a weapon and go shoot up a church someplace. And we've seen that, again and again. We're in a situation where every 2 or 3 years there's some kind of a mass murder motivated by this vague, great replacement theory ideology, whether it's in Charleston or El Paso or Pittsburgh. It happens with some regularity. And it's very, very difficult for the FBI to anticipate and prevent each of those attacks.
My guest is David Kirkpatrick. We're talking about his article in The New Yorker titled Infiltrating the Far Right. We'll be right back. This is Fresh Air.
I'm Jeremy Hobson. Next time on The Middle, Generation Z makes up about a quarter of the U.S. population. They could be a big voting bloc. So what are young voters most concerned about? That's our question, and we want to hear from you, especially if you're under, let's say, 40. Call 844-4MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. And join us Thursday night at 7 and Sunday mornings at 11 here on CPR News, KRCC, and on the Colorado Public Radio app.
Support for NPR comes from the station and from Bank of America, offering access to resources and digital tools designed to help local to global companies make moves for their businesses. Learn more at bankofamerica.com/banking-for-business. And from Indeed, designed to be an end-to-end hiring solution for businesses of all sizes to attract, interview, and hire candidates all from one platform. Learn more at Indeed.com/NPR.
This is Fresh Air. Let's get back to my interview with David Kirkpatrick, a staff writer at The New Yorker. In his latest article, he reports on how vigilante anti-fascist spies are going undercover to become members of white nationalist groups in order to gather information to thwart violent actions and expose leaders and members of the groups. So in your article, you say that Congress passed legislation that requires the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to collect and share comprehensive data on domestic violent extremist crime. What are they doing to follow up on that?
Well, the FBI is continuing to use their politically neutral categories, anti-government extremist, racially or ethnically motivated extremist, to the frustration of some of the people in Congress who passed that legislation. What they're hoping is that greater information is kind of a way out of this dilemma the FBI finds itself in. So the FBI will say to you, yes, we see this extremist violence problem, but our hands are tied because of the First Amendment. And what these people in Congress are hoping is that more transparent disclosure about who's committing politically motivated crimes and why they're committing them, including the ideology of the perpetrators. If that information is clearly presented, then it'll be easier for the FBI and for prosecutors and for courts to look at these things as crimes rather than beliefs. That you can focus, that if there was more information and more transparency about who's committing these political crimes and why, then it would be easier to go after the criminals without worrying too much about whether or not you were unfairly targeting someone on the basis of their ideology.
The far right is using as one of its tools the Supreme Court decision Brandenburg versus Ohio, a 1969 decision. What's the case and what's its significance? How is the far right using it?
So that's a case involving the Ku Klux Klan and a Ku Klux Klan leader. And the Supreme Court found that the First Amendment, yes, it protects expressing bigotry, but what's more, it also protects calling for violence, as long as it's not planning or inciting imminent violence. And that decision, I think, is really the outer edge of First Amendment jurisprudence. To go beyond saying, this is a country where you can call for the overthrow of our government, this is a country where you can express any bigoted idea you want, all the way to saying you can even call for violence in an abstract way against some minority group who you particularly detest. That too is protected by the First Amendment. So that's the outer reaches of America's First Amendment jurisprudence. And so that is what lawyers for these far-right groups cite when they defend the right of people on the far right to call for violence.
What about shouting fire in a crowded theater? I mean, is that...
Well, that's imminent incitement, and that's why, from the FBI's point of view, this gets very treacherous, right? Because, yes, when someone is planning a specific attack, not only are they allowed to take action, they have to take action, right? That's really important. We really rely on law enforcement for that. And yet, we have this jurisprudence that says that while it's still abstract, while you're just musing aloud about how great it would be to kill large numbers of group X, Y, or Z, that's fine. It's only when you start stockpiling weapons, when you start setting a particular time and place, when you begin to put a plan in motion, then we expect the FBI suddenly to get up out of its chair and swoop in and arrest that person before they can put that plan into action. It's quite a lot to ask of the FBI, not only in carrying out their role as law enforcement, but also adjudicating those legal niceties.
And this is also where the lone wolves come in, because there's a lot of impressionable people who hear these calls for violence, and even if it's not illegal to call for violence, if there's not a specific attack plan, the lone wolves can pick up on that and take on the responsibility themselves, which is what we're seeing happening.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have publicly said many times over the last decade that the number one threat right now is, one, domestic extremists, but two, individuals, not groups, individuals who pick up their ideas over the internet and decide on their own to take up arms and carry out some kind of atrocious attack. And indeed, we are seeing that every 2 or 3 years.
My guest is David Kirkpatrick. We're talking about his article in The New Yorker titled Infiltrating the Far Right. We'll be right back. This is Fresh Air.
Support comes from Colorado College, offering the block plan in which students can focus completely on one class at a time with global education and field study. Learn more at coloradocollege.edu/global and field study.
For some, lemonade stands are just a childhood memory. For others, they've become a side hustle.
It's extremely simple. It's literally 4 ingredients, lemons, water, ice, and sugar.
I'm Kristen Schwab. A look at the business of literally turning lemons into lemonade, next time on Marketplace.
That's at 3 o'clock on KRCC and CPR News.
He reports on how exposed leaders and what happened to Vincent Washington, the individual who infiltrated the white nationalist group Patriot Front? He was outed. Vincent Washington was just a code name. What happened to him after he was outed? And who outed him?
So, when Unicorn Riot published all the leaks that they had obtained through the person we're calling Vincent Washington, they carefully scrubbed his voice. In the recordings Vincent obtained, when the Vincent person is speaking in the meeting, it sounds like one of the adults on the Peanuts cartoons. The voice is kind of obscured, and they took out all the lines of chat that were from Vincent Washington. So they did their best to protect him. But the guys he'd infiltrated, the Patriot Front cell around Seattle, knew right away who had infiltrated them, which of their members failed to show up at the airport to fly off to their protest in Washington, D.C., and it didn't take them very long to figure out that, in fact, Vincent Washington had the same face as a pretty well-known local anti-fascist activist. So they were able to suss it out right away. What's interesting is this particular group of white nationalists who had been exposed, some of them decided to take legal action. Some of them got in touch with a lawyer based in Baltimore named Glenn Allen, who filed a lawsuit against Vincent Washington. They discovered the name he was born under. He changed his name several times. They learned some more about who he was, and they filed this lawsuit under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, blaming him for the fact that several of these white nationalists had been fired from their jobs after their exposure as white nationalists. So they're saying this person fraudulently abused our computer system, stole this information, divulged it, and as a result of that, we've been exposed as white nationalists. He's caused us a lot of harm. We want to take him to court. And that's an unusual case. That's kind of a novel use of that bit of legislation, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And it's also a kind of a new turn of the screw, if you will, where some of these white nationalists are actually using the law to go after the infiltrators. For now, it's not clear when that suit is going to be able to go forward because the person we're calling Vincent Washington has disappeared. There's no way to serve him. They haven't yet found him. He's not responding. He's gone completely underground.
It is a very interesting turn of events. It shows how complicated this world is and how for every action there's a reaction. So, like, there's victories which are followed by defeats.
Yeah, there's one other interesting thing about Vincent Washington that I learned in reporting this article. We learned that after he had exposed Patriot Front, the FBI came calling some of his friends and associates around Seattle not to try to find out information about Patriot Front, but instead because they had been tipped off that the person we're calling Vincent Washington might himself be a dangerous left-wing extremist. So it looks very much like some of these Patriot Front guys who've been exposed in his sting call up the FBI and said, hey, the person here who's really a problem is Vincent Washington. And the FBI took that seriously enough to at least make a few inquiries.
You've covered the far right in the U.S. on and off for years, at least 20 years. When you compare what's happening now to what happened when you started covering the far right, what differences do you see?
That's a really good question. When I first started covering the right 20 years ago, I was covering the right of the Republican Party and its allies. And honestly, that right is really gone. You know, then we were talking about a kind of Christian conservative movement organizing around getting more religion into public life, opposing abortion, opposing same-sex marriage, you know, and that right was very, very noisily and ostentatiously eager to reach out to African Americans and Latinos. Now what we're seeing in the right edge of the Republican Party is much more, for lack of a better word, racially or ethnically oriented. You know, what we're hearing from former President Trump and his supporters is much more xenophobia about undocumented immigrants and maybe immigrants in general. Much more of a talk from President Trump and his allies of a, you know, in a recent interview, he described a kind of anti-white animus in this country that he thought he was going to correct. That's certainly going to surprise a lot of people who've studied American history or even lived in this country. And what I'm writing about now is even a step beyond that. I mean, what I'm writing about now is not just the Trump movement, not just MAGA, not just the right edges of the Republican Party, but a giant step further to the right. You know, people who are unabashedly white nationalists, who are really putting a white identity and their fear of the coming day when white people are no longer a majority in this country, when they're putting that anxiety and that identity at the center of their vision. So you hear kind of faint echoes of that in the Trump movement, but what we're seeing now in these periodic mass shootings and in groups like Patriot Front is a real flourishing of that idea, a giant step beyond the Republican Party. And so, one, the right I'm covering now is further to the right, but two, the right has changed. You know, it's not about religion in the way that it was 20 years ago, and it seems to be much more about race.
Well, David Kirkpatrick, I want to thank you so much for your reporting and for coming back to our show.
It's always a pleasure, even when the subject is somewhat grim.
David Kirkpatrick is a staff writer at The New Yorker. His latest article is titled Infiltrating the Far Right. If you'd like to catch up on interviews you've missed, like Tanya's conversation this week with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, check out our podcast. You'll find lots of fresh air interviews. And to find out what's happening behind the scenes of our show and get our producers' recommendations for what to watch, read, and listen to, Subscribe to our free newsletter at whyy.org/freshair. Fresh Air's executive producer is Danny Miller. Our technical director and engineer is Roger Benson. Our interviews and reviews are produced and edited by Phyllis Myers, Roberta Shorak, Anne Mabel Donato, Sam Brigger, Lauren Fenzo, Teresa Madden, Monique Nazareth, Susan Yatunde, and Joel Wolfram. Our digital media producers are Molly Siganesper and Sabrina Seward. Thea Challoner directed today's show. Our co-host is Tanya Mosley. I'm Carrie Gray.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Americans United for Separation of Church and State. For more than 75 years, AU has supported freedom without favor and equality without exception. Learn more at au.org/NPR. And from the NPR Wine Club, bringing people wines inspired by NPR shows. Whether purchasing a few bottles or joining the club, every purchase supports NPR. Available to adults 21 or older. nprwineclub.org.
If you're over 70 and a half, you may be able to transfer funds from your IRA to Colorado Public Radio without paying additional federal income tax. The IRA charitable rollover is an excellent way to support Colorado Public Radio and receive tax benefits in return. And
Support comes from businesses and organizations including Intermountain Health, offering video visits, in-person appointments, and life-saving emergency care. Learn more at